Tennessee gives landlords broad freedom to set and raise rent, and the state has taken active steps to ensure that local governments can't change that. If you manage rental property in Tennessee, you operate in a firmly pro-market environment. But there are still procedural requirements and legal boundaries you need to understand. The governing law is found in the Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, Tennessee Code Annotated, Title 66, Chapter 28. Tennessee does not have rent control or rent stabilization. There is no state statute that limits how much a landlord can increase rent, how frequently increases can occur, or that requires landlords to submit increases for government approval. Tennessee's political and regulatory philosophy strongly supports property rights and market-driven pricing. Like several other landlord-friendly states, Tennessee has enacted a preemption statute that prevents local governments from implementing rent control. Under Tennessee Code Section 66-35-102, no county or municipality in Tennessee can enact, maintain, or enforce any ordinance or resolution that would have the effect of controlling the amount of rent charged for privately owned, single-family, or multifamily residential property. This means Nashville, Memphis, Knoxville, Chattanooga, and every other Tennessee municipality are legally prohibited from imposing rent caps. This preemption is important because without it, cities like Nashville, which has experienced explosive growth and significant rent increases, might face political pressure to enact local rent restrictions. The preemption ensures a uniform statewide framework that gives landlords certainty regardless of where their property is located. For month-to-month tenancies, the landlord must provide advance written notice before a rent increase takes effect. Tennessee requires at least 30 days' notice before the end of the rental period for changes to the terms of a month-to-month tenancy. So if rent is due on the 1st and you want the increase to take effect on May 1st, you need to deliver written notice by April 1st at the latest. The notice should be in writing and should clearly state the current rent, the new rent amount, and the effective date. While Tennessee doesn't prescribe a specific statutory form for rent increase notices, a clear written notice delivered by a documented method is strongly recommended. Acceptable delivery methods include personal delivery, leaving a copy at the tenant's residence, or sending by mail. For fixed-term leases, the rent is locked in for the duration of the lease term, unless the lease itself includes a provision allowing mid-term increases. Escalation clauses, CPI adjustments, and provisions tied to property tax changes are all enforceable in Tennessee, as long as both parties agreed to the provision when the lease was signed. Without such a provision, the landlord must wait until the lease expires and negotiate the new rent as part of a renewal or new lease. When a fixed-term lease is approaching expiration, the landlord should communicate the proposed new rent well in advance. Tennessee doesn't prescribe a specific notice period for rent increases at renewal, since the increase is part of a new contractual agreement, but providing ample advance notice allows the tenant to make an informed decision about whether to renew. If the tenant doesn't agree to the new rate, the lease expires at the end of its term and the tenant either vacates or the tenancy converts to a month-to-month arrangement. For week-to-week tenancies, the notice requirement for rent changes follows the general rule: notice equal to 1 rental period, which for a weekly tenancy would be 10 days under Tennessee's statute. This is slightly longer than the 7 days most states require for weekly tenancies, and is specific to Tennessee. Now let's cover the restrictions that apply even in the absence of rent control. Rent increases cannot be retaliatory. Tennessee has an anti-retaliation provision under Section 66-28-514 that prohibits landlords from taking adverse action, including raising rent, in retaliation for a tenant exercising their legal rights. Protected activities include making a good faith complaint about habitability to the landlord or a government agency, exercising any right or remedy under the Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, and participating in a tenants organization. Tennessee's anti-retaliation provision doesn't specify a fixed presumption period the way some states do, but courts evaluate the timing and circumstances of the rent increase relative to the tenant's protected activity. A significant rent increase shortly after a tenant files a code enforcement complaint creates a strong inference of retaliation. The landlord would need to demonstrate that the increase was motivated by legitimate business factors, market conditions, operating cost increases, or property improvements, rather than by the tenant's complaint. If a court finds that a rent increase was retaliatory, the tenant can recover damages. The specific remedies depend on the circumstances, but the landlord may be liable for actual damages and attorney's fees. More importantly, a finding of retaliation can undermine the landlord's credibility in any related legal proceedings, including eviction actions. Rent increases also cannot be discriminatory. Under the Federal Fair Housing Act and the Tennessee Human Rights Act, found in Tennessee Code Title 4, Chapter 21, landlords cannot raise rent based on a tenant's race, color, religion, national origin, sex, disability, or familial status. The Tennessee Human Rights Commission investigates complaints and can take enforcement action, including ordering damages and civil penalties. A discriminatory rent increase can be established through evidence of disparate treatment, meaning that tenants in a protected category were treated differently from other tenants in comparable situations. If a landlord raises rent for all units occupied by families with children, but keeps rent stable for units occupied by singles or couples without children, that pattern could support a discrimination claim even if the landlord never explicitly stated a discriminatory motive. The safest approach is to apply rent increases uniformly across comparable units and to document the business justification for each increase. Keep records of market data, operating cost changes, and any property improvements that support your pricing decisions. From a practical standpoint, Tennessee's rental market has been one of the most dynamic in the Southeast over the past decade. Nashville, in particular, has experienced transformative growth, with population influx driven by healthcare, music industry, technology, and corporate relocations. Nashville's rental market saw dramatic rent increases during the recent growth period, with some areas experiencing double-digit annual increases. Even with recent moderation, Nashville remains a strong landlord's market with significant pricing power. Memphis has a different market dynamic, more affordable overall, with pockets of strong demand in areas like downtown, midtown, and the medical district. Memphis landlords typically see more moderate rent increases than Nashville, and the market is more sensitive to local economic conditions. The city's large renter population and lower median incomes mean that aggressive increases can lead to higher vacancy rates in some neighborhoods. Knoxville, home to the University of Tennessee, has a rental market influenced by the university, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and the regional healthcare sector. Student housing near the university follows its own cycle, with rent adjustments typically occurring at the beginning of each academic year. The broader Knoxville market has seen steady growth, but at a more moderate pace than Nashville. Chattanooga has emerged as a desirable mid-sized city with a growing technology sector and a strong quality-of-life reputation. The rental market has tightened in recent years, and landlords have been able to implement meaningful increases. The city's riverfront redevelopment and downtown revitalization have created particularly strong demand in the urban core. Smaller Tennessee cities and rural areas have softer rental markets where large increases are harder to sustain. In communities where tenants have more options and incomes are lower, pricing must be more conservative. Understanding the specific dynamics of your local market is essential for setting appropriate rent levels. One best practice for Tennessee landlords: time your rent increases strategically. In Nashville's competitive market, annual increases of 3 to 7% are common and generally well absorbed by the market. In softer markets like parts of Memphis or rural Tennessee, smaller increases, or even holding rent steady to retain a good tenant, may generate better financial results when you factor in the costs of vacancy and turnover. Another best practice? For fixed-term leases, include clear language about how rent will be handled at renewal. A lease provision stating that the landlord will provide notice of the renewal rent at least 60 days before the lease expires gives both parties time to plan. Some landlords include a clause specifying a maximum annual increase percentage, such as 5%, which gives the tenant predictability while preserving the landlord's ability to adjust pricing. Tennessee landlords should also understand how rent increases interact with the state's manufactured home community laws. Under the Tennessee Manufactured Home Park Act, there are specific notice requirements for lot rent increases in manufactured home communities that differ from standard residential tenancies. If you own or manage a manufactured home community, make sure you're following the specific requirements of that statute. For landlords who participate in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, rent increases must be approved by the local housing authority. The authority evaluates whether the proposed rent is reasonable by comparing it to comparable unassisted units in the area. Submit increase requests well in advance of the desired effective date to allow time for review. One more consideration. Tennessee's rapid growth has brought increased attention to housing affordability, and while the state's preemption statute currently prevents local rent control, the political conversation around affordable housing continues to evolve. Legislative proposals related to housing affordability are introduced regularly, and while rent control remains unlikely in Tennessee's current political environment, landlords should stay informed about developments that could affect the regulatory landscape. For the complete guide to Tennessee rent increase laws, visit tenantscreeningbackgroundcheck.com. Subscribe to our channel for every state in our Landlord Tenant Law series.